Okay, let's unpack this. So you've shared a stack of sources about U.S. immigration and customs enforcement, ICE.
Yeah, quite a collection.
We've got everything from the official history and structure, the agency stuff, right through to personal accounts, news reports, even online forum discussions.
Or a real mix.
So our mission for this deep dive is, well, to pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the key insights, to give you a really comprehensive, well-informed picture.
Exactly. A picture of this pretty complex agency, where it came from, what it does, and all the different views on it.
Crucially, based only on the information you provided in these sources.
That's the rule. And the sources, they really do offer a fascinating look at how ICE was created, the sheer breadth of its job, and the very real impact it has, from big national security questions down to individual lives.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. The origin story, according to these sources, ICE was born out of the Homeland Security Act of 2002.
Right, a direct response to 9/11. And the idea, based on what we're seeing here, was to centralize functions, things that were kind of scattered before.
Scattered where? Like old agencies?
Yeah, functions from the old Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, remember them?
Vaguely.
Plus parts of the U.S. Customs Service. They were sort of rolled together into this new agency, ICE.
And that merger gave ICE something pretty unique, didn't it? The sources mentioned this blend of civil and criminal authorities.
That's a key point. It really isn't typical for one single agency to hold both. And the sources really highlight that this dual authority is, well, fundamental to understanding just how broad ICE's scope is.
And its stated mission,
Yeah.
pulling from the archived material you gave us, it's wide, like surprisingly wide.
It is. Preventing terrorism, securing borders, enforcing immigration law. Okay, that fits.
Right, what you expect.
But then also safeguarding cyberspace. And ensuring resilience and disaster response.
Okay, wait. Cyberspace, disaster response. That's not the first thing that springs to mind when you hear ICE.
Not at all. It really shows just how broad that initial mandate was written.
And where does it sit in the government structure?
The sources position it as the largest investigative arm of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS.
The largest, wow.
Yeah. And it even contributes personnel to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Okay, so we have the why, the post-9/11 context, and the what, this broad mission. How is this massive agency actually structured? How does it operate day to day? Because the sources tell us it's big.
Oh, it's big. The 2025 numbers cited put it at over 21,800 employees.
21,000.
And a budget, get this, over $9.1 billion.
$9 billion. Okay, that's a serious footprint.
Definitely. And operationally, the sources break it down into two main components, two primary directorates.
Right, two distinct sides.
Exactly. You've got Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and then Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO.
HSI and ERO.
And the sources make it really clear these two have pretty different focuses.
Okay, let's take HSI first then. Sources say it's focused on disrupting transnational crime. What does that actually mean in practice? What kind of work are we talking about?
HSI tackles, well, a really diverse range of criminal activity based on these documents.
Like what?
Everything from online child exploitation, and the sources mention specific programs here, like the Victim Identification Program, Operation Sunflower,
Okay.
to major drug trafficking busts. Operation Pacific Rim is cited. Financial crimes, like big money laundering schemes. There's an example from the LA Fashion District.
Wow, okay. So really serious, complex stuff.
Yeah. Identity fraud, internet counterfeiting, and piracy operation in our sites is mentioned for that. Even things like car theft rings, maybe tied to cartels, and export control violations.
So HSI's reach goes way beyond just immigration issues then.
Oh, absolutely. The sources show HSI investigations covering human trafficking, intellectual property rights violations via the National IPR Coordination Center. It's broad. There's even a unit mentioned, the HERO Corps, Human Exploitation Rescue Operative Child Rescue Corps.
HERO Corps.
Yeah, it recruits wounded veterans, apparently, to do computer forensic analysis, specifically for child exploitation cases.
That's quite specific, and it highlights the kind of specialized skills they need on that side.
It really does. It paints a picture of HSI as a major federal investigative body, not just an immigration one.
Okay. That's a surprising scope for, just one half of an agency, often solely linked to immigration in the public mind. Now, let's switch to the other side. ERO. Enforcement and Removal Operations. This is the one that well, seems to get most of the attention right.
It certainly is. The sources consistently describe ERO's main function as apprehending, detaining, and ultimately removing undocumented immigrants.
How does that work? Where do they find people?
Well, they work with Border Patrol, taking in individuals caught at the border, but ERO also has interior offices that conduct targeted operations,
Targeted how?
often focusing on individuals with criminal histories, according to the sources, but it's definitely described as one of ICE's most public and often most contentious functions.
Yeah, you see that in the news reports and forum discussions you provided. And the sources list specific ERO programs, right, to carry out this mission.
Yes, things like the Criminal Alien Program, Secure Communities, Operation Crosscheck is mentioned, targeting non-citizens with criminal convictions specifically, the Alien Transfer and Exit Program, the Criminal Alien Removal Initiative.
So specific initiatives aimed at identifying and processing people for removal.
Based on their immigration status, yes, often linked, as the sources say, to criminal activity or prior removal orders.
Okay. So HSI and ERO are the two big operational arms. Are there other parts mentioned? Supporting roles?
Yeah, the sources mention supporting divisions too. Things like management and program administration, the sort of back office functions.
Makes sense.
The Office of Principal Legal Advisor, OPLA, that's ICE's legal team, essentially.
Right.
And the Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, which handles internal affairs, conduct investigations, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And a huge part of ERO's job, it seems, from the sources, involves detention, managing facilities.
A very significant part. One source cites a figure, around 34,000 people held daily.
34,000 daily, wow. Across how many places?
Over 500 facilities, according to that source. Now, these aren't all IC-owned. Many are contracts with local jails or private companies.
And who gets detained?
The sources state these facilities hold individuals suspected of being in the country illegally and who are determined to pose a reasonable threat, though that term itself can be debated.
And it's interesting, one source notes the opening of the first facility specifically designated as a civil detention center in Karnes, Texas. Civil, not criminal.
Yes, that distinction is pointed out.
The sources also mention some other tools and programs, like there's an online system.
Right, the online detainee locator system, so people can try to find someone in custody. There's also the visa security program operating overseas.
And something for employers.
Yeah, the image program, which is about partnership with employers on hiring compliance, and a personnel recovery unit for staff overseas.
Okay. And of course, agents and officers are armed. The sources touch on that.
They do, standard issue sidearms. The sources note a shift over time. Glocks, H&Ks, SIGs were used historically. Currently, it says the standard is a SIG Sauer P320C, using 9mm hollow point ammunition.
And they can carry personal weapons, too.
If they meet quarterly qualification standards, yes, according to the sources.
Okay, so it's a vast agency, distinct parts, doing everything from investigating complex international crime to managing a huge detention system. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the history, the context provided in the sources. How has the approach to enforcement changed over time?
It's interesting. The sources mention some key leaders from the early days, Michael Garcia, Julie Myers, John Morton.
Right.
But then there's this observation that the agency hasn't actually had a Senate-confirmed director since 2017.
That's quite a long time without confirmed leadership in the top.
It is. And the sources also take us back further, before IC even existed, looking at the broader immigration enforcement picture. There are quotes cited from President Clinton in the mid-90s.
What did they say?
Talking about securing borders, increasing the number of guards and inspectors, deporting criminal aliens faster, cracking down on illegal hiring.
Sounds familiar in some ways.
It does. Denying benefits, denying contracts to businesses hiring undocumented workers, but also acknowledging, the nation of immigrants idea while still emphasizing laws.
And one source makes a point about this, right?
Yeah.
That this kind of enforcement focus wasn't always so partisan.
Exactly. That source points out that historically, these kinds of enforcement efforts actually had support from both major political parties. It wasn't necessarily the lightning rod it is today.
But things changed. Another source suggests a shift.
Yes, one source specifically notes that under the Trump administration, the focus seemed to widen. Beyond just those with serious criminal records, it started encompassing, according to this source, workers without status, student activists, even tourists who overstayed. A broader net, essentially.
And the sources mention specific policies or events over the years.
Yeah, things like repatriation agreements being signed, like with Vietnam, the use of prosecutorial discretion reviews being implemented, then maybe scaled back. The activation of secure communities is a big one mentioned.
Secure communities, right.
Establishment of the National Bulk Cash Smuggling Center. Little units like an on-site detention monitoring unit, the Hero Corps we mentioned earlier.
Okay. And there's this really striking parallel drawn in one source,
Which one?
comparing recent ICE raids, like some mentioned in Omaha, to INS raids back in the early 1990s.
Ah, right, highlighting the continuity.
Yeah, pointing out the similar economic impact on communities when workers are removed, and crucially, how trust broke down back then after a controversial incident involving an agent. It shows these tensions, these impacts, they have deep roots.
It really grounds the policy discussion in lived experience and longer historical trends, doesn't it? These aren't just abstract policies.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next section, moving from policy and history right into the personal dimension. The sources you provided contain some really detailed, sometimes harrowing, accounts of people's actual experiences with ICE. And the allegations made, the concerns raised.
Yeah, this is where the human impact comes into sharp focus. The sources include some pretty disturbing descriptions of detention conditions.
Like what specifically?
Accounts mentioning being ordered to strip naked multiple times for searches. Mandatory medical exams, including, according to these accounts, gynecological or pregnancy tests, even if not strictly necessary. Descriptions of conditions being perceived as inhumane concrete cells, maybe no blanket, limited bathroom access. One person in an account lost a significant amount of weight while detained. Some described treatment in civil detention as worse than what they'd expect in a jail.
And beyond conditions, there are very serious allegations reported in the sources too, right?
Extremely serious. Allegations of sexual abuse within facilities are mentioned.
And forced sterilization.
That allegation is also present in the source material provided. And other issues too, like reports cited regarding Muslim detainees allegedly being repeatedly served pork or getting religiously compliant meals that were expired or rotten.
Wow. Okay. Another huge concern that comes up in the sources is wrongful detention. U.S. citizens being detained.
Yes. One investigation cited found that between 2012 and early 2018, ICE wrongfully arrested and detained 1,480 U.S. citizens.
1,400. How does that even happen?
The sources suggest it was often due to reliance on incomplete or, frankly, error-prone government databases, mix-ups in identity, bad data.
And these weren't short detentions.
Not always. Some citizens were held for months, even years, some multiple times. The sources give examples. One U.S. citizen held for 1,273 days.
Over 3 years.
As a citizen.
According to that source, yes. A Canadian actress detailed her nearly 2-week detention in difficult conditions. A German national detained at an airport based on old charges that had been dismissed.
And the sources raise concerns about why this happens. Potential bias. Concerns are definitely raised in the sources about U.S. citizens being detained, potentially due to racial profiling or misrepresentation of their status by officers.
Family separation is another major issue mentioned in the sources.
Along with a related, deeply concerning issue, fears that detained children could potentially be given up for adoption without parental notification or consent. One source specifically criticizes agencies like Bethany Christian Services in relation to this.
Okay, shifting from detention to enforcement actions out in the community, the sources talk about raids.
Yes, raids on various places are discussed. Workplaces like a car wash mentioned in one BBC article, but also homes, farms, hotels, restaurants.
The one source mentioned a pause on some of those.
Yes, a recent pause mentioned for raids on farms, hotels, and restaurants specifically.
And people are concerned about how ICE finds individuals. This comes up in the forum discussions you provided.
Yeah, concerns are expressed in those forums about ICE potentially finding people through, say, school records or using sophisticated data analysis.
Data analysis.
Right.
Like AI.
One source specifically mentions Palantir's Immigration OS system. It describes it as a platform plan to link various federal and state databases, driver's licenses, utility bills, social media using AI for tracking visa overstays, predicting locations, managing enforcement.
Wow, that sounds powerful and potentially intrusive.
That's certainly the concern raised. The sources also mention other enforcement tools, like huge fines being issued. One example cited a $1.8 million fine for failing to depart.
$1.8 million.
That's the figure in the source. And instances where arrests, even for charges later dropped, were used as the basis for deportation proceedings.
It's also really notable that the sources include examples where people who entered the U.S. legally still ended up detained.
Right. A student visa holder mentioned in one account, a legal permanent resident, a green card holder in another. And as we discussed, even U.S. citizens.
Like the cases cited involving Kabi Lam's detention experience, or that almost unbelievable story of a U.S. Marshal being mistakenly detained by ICE agents.
These examples from the sources really underscore how complex navigating the system can be and how enforcement actions can affect a wide range of people, not just those who cross the border without authorization.
And this brings up another point raised in the sources, the legal immigration process itself.
Yeah, several sources, particularly the forum discussions, describe the legal path as, well, incredibly difficult.
How so?
Painful, slow, very expensive, with really strict, complex regulations. Examples are given the challenges of getting a green card, even for a spouse, difficulties getting tourist visas for family members. The estimated time and cost for different paths, family-based, employment-based, asylum, marriage, are laid out as being substantial.
And this difficulty is presented as a reason why.
Why some people might feel they have no other option than to enter or remain without authorization, even if they'd prefer to follow the rules. The legal path just seems inaccessible to many, according to these sources.
Okay, so given all this, the history, the structure, the operations, these deeply personal experiences and serious allegations, it's really no surprise that the sources show ICE is at the heart of intense debate.
Absolutely. There's a huge spectrum of perspectives here on ICE itself and on the wider U.S. immigration system.
And the sources lay out arguments from different sides. There are clear calls within the material you provided for major reform, even abolition.
Right. Ideas like dissolving ERO, the enforcement arm, and maybe moving its necessary functions like processing paperwork under U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS.
Which is seen as more administrative, less enforcement-focused.
Exactly. The argument presented in those sources is often about changing the agency's culture away from pure enforcement, a belief that legal and administrative reforms are what's needed, not just more enforcement power.
Some sources frame ICE as unnecessary federal overreach, right?
Yes, or argue that its policies and practices are aggressive, inhumane, even unconstitutional. Violating unreasonable search and seizure protections is one claim cited.
And there are allegations of bias and lack of accountability.
Yes, claims of racial bias are present, along with a perceived lack of accountability. And some sources contain very strong comparisons, likening ICE tactics to agencies like the Gestapo or KGB, very charged language.
Okay. But then on the other side, the sources also present arguments defending ICE and the current system.
They do. A key point made in these sources is that ICE is simply enforcing laws passed by Congress, by policymakers. It doesn't make the laws, it enforces them.
And that enforcement is necessary.
Yes. Supporters cited argued that enforcement is essential for national security, for border management, that it's a core function of government.
The argument about detaining dangerous criminals also comes up.
Right. That it's a positive outcome, removing individuals who pose a threat. And regarding the legal system's difficulty, some argue that while frustrating, the difficulty and cost of legal immigration aren't unique to the U.S. It's complex globally, and they raise concerns about real threats, cartels, human trafficking, people using false identities, arguing these necessitate robust enforcement.
There are also debates within the sources about who should be targeted, right? Individuals or employers.
Yes, that debate is reflected. Should the focus be on removing undocumented workers or penalizing the businesses that hire them?
And politics inevitably comes up.
No, definitely. Criticisms are voiced in the sources suggesting political motivations interfere with sensible policy. Claims that attempts to pass immigration reform, like a potential border deal mentioned, were blocked for political campaign reasons.
Or that certain enforcement actions are more about appearances, about being performative, than effective policy.
That perspective is certainly present. The sources also touch on the whole issue of sanctuary cities.
Right, the conflicts there.
Mentioning the challenges and legal battles, particularly under the Trump administration, related to attempts to tie federal funding to local cooperation with ICE.
And finally, going back to the community level, the sources consistently highlight the impact.
Yeah, the economic harm when large numbers of people are removed from a local workforce, but also the climate of fear it creates.
Fear not just among the undocumented.
No, fear among residents more broadly, including citizens and documented immigrants, leading to people staying home, businesses shutting down, or seeing reduced activity. A chilling effect described in some sources.
So, faced with all this complexity, do the sources offer any alternative approaches?
Some discussions lean towards alternatives, investing more in people, finding ways to integrate individuals who've built lives and contributed over many years.
Looking beyond just enforcement.
Right, and addressing root causes why people migrate in the first place. Some sources connect this to the impact of U.S. foreign policy or economic policies abroad.
It is incredibly clear from everything you've shared from these sources that ICE sits right at the intersection of so many complex, often deeply personal and highly contentious issues.
Absolutely. The sources, taken together, they paint this picture of an agency born from a specific crisis, 9/11, given this incredibly broad, maybe even conflicting mandate, operating in ways that undeniably provoke very strong reactions, both positive and negative, and impacting individual lives and whole communities in profound ways.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. As you can see from this deep dive into the sources you've provided, ICE is, well, it's complicated.
Understatement, maybe.
Yeah, it's got this complex history, this massive mandate covering everything from national security and transnational crime to immigration enforcement on the ground.
Yeah.
Its operations spark intense debate, have huge impacts.
We've seen the official structure, the mission statements.
Right. And specific examples of HSI tackling crime rings, ERO conducting removals.
But also the personal stories, the allegations reported in news and forums, wrongful detentions, tough conditions, the sheer difficulty of the legal immigration path itself.
The range of information in your sources just underscores how multifaceted this whole topic is, how consequential.
So what does this all mean?
Well, it means understanding ICE, based purely on these sources you gave us, requires looking at the official lines, the stated goals, but also really grappling with the reported realities, the historical shifts, the policy debates, and just the incredibly wide spectrum of views on its role and its impact.
It's not simple.
Not at all. And based on this deep dive into your sources, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Considering this whole spectrum we've discussed, the agency's security focus, the law enforcement mandate versus the personal accounts, the community impacts, and thinking about that mention in the sources of increasing reliance on advanced data analysis, like that planned Palantir AI system. How might the future balance between, say, enforcement efficiency and the actual human experience of the immigration system? How might that balance be reshaped by these kinds of powerful new technologies?